As I prepared for this evening, somebody who saw my title wondered if I was going to talk about loving the aliens and the strangers, about tonight whether we were going to talk about UFOs. We're not science fiction tonight. We're looking into God's Word, and the alien, of course, refers to the refugee and to the immigrant who is among us. The last 2 Sundays have brought some startling revelations about how we're called to live out the holiness of God in the details of everyday life. Leviticus 19 began with these memorable verses that echo a refrain that has been a constant beat, not only in our journey through Leviticus, but also that comes through again and again in the book of Exodus. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the congregation of the people of Israel, say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." From the moment he first sets his love on this people, when he redeems them from slavery in Egypt through the crossing of the desert, and then as they establish a new life and a new kind of community in the promised land, God repeats this call again and again. "I'm the Lord your God, you shall be holy, because I am holy." So 2 Sunday evenings ago, we discovered that the holiness of God isn't just about what we do when we come to church to worship on Sunday. The holiness of God and living it out is about all of life, from the way we buy our groceries at IGA to the way we do our laundry. Then last week, we discovered that holiness wasn't just about our relationship with God, it's also about our relationship with people. And not just about our relationship with the few good people that we know and trust to be clean like we are who we meet here at church. Rather than leading us to cloister and to isolate ourselves in a monastery away from the bad world, we're called to live out the holiness of God in the midst of the darkness of the world where it makes a difference. The tail end of chapter 19 that we want to work through tonight, just with the high point, continues to drive that thought home. It walks the narrow line and it says, okay, we are not part of the world. We don't want to be soiled and stained by what's around us, but we need to be in the middle of it. It probably best expressed with those words that Jesus told his disciples, "You are not of the world, but you are in the world." So God's people were to be separate, they were to be distinct from the world, they weren't to be mixed in with it, and yet they were to be in the middle of it. In the world, but not of the world. At first glance, tonight is a challenging text because it appears to be just a loose collection of unrelated instructions and directions. I have a lawyer friend who tells me that when the governments put laws together to be passed before the provincial or the federal parliament, when they start putting the bill together, the bill that will become a law when it's enacted by the parliament or legislative assembly, they start by putting the paragraphs together that sort of make sense. And the law's going to be about this, and they got to do A and B and C, and usually near the tail end of the law, they end up with there's a whole bunch of little loose bits and pieces that need to be dealt with, but that don't easily fit in any one of the big paragraphs. And so he tells me that usually when they put these laws together, when they put these bills together and they assemble all the wording, they've got all the big paragraphs explaining what the new bill, the new law is going to do, and at the end they wind up with a little handful of loose bits and pieces that have to be in the law somewhere in the new bill, but it doesn't fit anywhere, so they kind of have a catch-all paragraph or two at the end that has this whole list of strange provisions that need to be included but sort of don't naturally fit anywhere. And apparently if you look through the official gazette, if you look at the laws, if you look at our civil code, if you look at our criminal code, in the end of many of these big paragraphs and bills of law, you'll find these loose bits and pieces of collections of items at the end. And some people kind of feel that Leviticus 19 is like that. There's a foray of 12 to 13 apparently unrelated paragraph where God tucks in a whole bunch of little things about holiness. But when you take a closer look, as we work our way through these paragraphs, there's actually a theme that develops. This isn't just a catch-all with a bunch of loose little things. There's this theme that will build its way through the paragraph as we work our way through. Leviticus 19. I want to read verse 1 and 2 again to you because it sets the tone. As I've said, it's this constant drumbeat in the background. Leviticus 19, verse 1. "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." You will be set apart. You'll be distinct. You'll be separate. And this separateness, this holiness, that we're called to is going to be illustrated in a couple of different ways in our homes. This begins in the early part of the chapter, and it continues through in verse 19 through to end. Verse 19, Leviticus 19:19, if you're following along in your Bible. You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your cattle breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed, nor shall you wear a garment of cloth made of two kinds of material. So the Lord forbids three specific kinds of mixes. You can't breed different cattle together. You can't mix seed planting side by side in the same field. And you can't wear garments made of a mix of materials. Kind of weird, isn't it? What in the world does this have to do with the holiness of God? Well, as happens with many other prohibitions that we find in the book of Leviticus, there are some who try to come up with some rational explanations about why you can't mix stuff and why you can't specifically mix these three things. The crossbreeding of cattle that's forbidden in between species, make sure we understand this, it's not different breeds of the same species. In other words, it's okay to breed your Angus bull with your Holstein cow. That's not what God says you shouldn't do. What God says you shouldn't do is you can't breed a horse with a donkey. It produces a mule, which is typically sterile. Those who try to rationalize the interdiction here suggest, it can be awkward. There's only a handful of species where you can crossbreed between the species. And you shouldn't do that. It's awkward. It's painful for the animals. It's disrespectful to them. And the result is often something unnatural that God would never have intended. Witness the fact that most mules can't reproduce after the fact. So of the three interdictions, if you insist on finding a scientific explanation why they're forbidden, this is probably the one that's easiest to justify in rational scientific terms. But then there's this prohibition against mixing seeds in the same field. Now understand, this isn't about rotating your crops. You know, a good farmer, when he plants his crops, one year he puts his corn here and his potatoes here and his squash over here, and the next year he mixes it up. He moves it from one spot to the other because the one plant tends to draw the same nutrients from the ground, and so if you move it around, you spread the nutrients and it's better for the soil. This isn't what God is saying not to do. It's okay to rotate your crops. What God is saying is that in the same field, at the same place, you can't plant your lettuce next to your carrots. You can't plant your beans next to your cucumber in the same field together, side by side. You can't put barley and oats in the same field. Well, this one's a little harder to explain. There's some people who, I watch some of the commentators, and I get the feeling that some of the commentators are trying to explain this. I don't think they're farmers. They come up with all kinds of weird and wacky rules. Well, if you put two kinds of seeds together, the seeds get confused, and I got to tell you, it's really hard to figure out why would God forbid this. There are a couple of seeds, there are a couple of kinds of veggies and fruits that get really aggressive, and if you plant them next to another seed, they'll take over and But there are just as many seeds that work really well in symbiotic relationships. In fact, we do that often in biology and agriculture today. There's a lot of crops that we intentionally plant side by side next to each other because they're helpful to one another. So it's hard to come up with a rational scientific explanation why this is problematic. Now, for those of you who are fashion conscious, imagine this prohibition. You can't wear 50% cotton, 50% polyester. You can't wear anything that's 50% wool and 50% cotton. I don't know about you, but if I lived by this rule, I'm not sure I'd have a whole lot left to wear in my wardrobe. Theologians have tried to explain this in a couple different ways. Well, they were a little more primitive in the way they did laundry, and if you had something that was mixed of wool and some other kind of thread, then when you washed them, they would shrink, and they wouldn't shrink evenly, and then the clothing would get deformed, and it was bad, and it could be kind of immodest if you had a dress or a skirt that was of two different kinds, and it opened up, and there were wider seams, and you could see stuff you weren't supposed to see, and the best explanation suggests that the high priest was the only one who's supposed to wear a garment. The garment that is described, the beautiful piece that he wore, the ornate head covering and sash and apron that he wore was a beautiful worked piece of garment that had different kinds of threads worked in together. And the thought is that the priest was the only one who was allowed to wear something fancy. So if you were a priest, you could buy stuff at Saks Fifth Avenue and fine looking, but the rest of you had to dress in bland, non-mixed clothing. But these attempts at rational explanation for the prohibition among mixing things, they don't really cover the whole gamut. What is at work here is not God's fashion sense or his horticultural wisdom about which plants to plant next to each other. And God isn't teaching us veterinary science either. God is driving home this principle of separation and distinction that is required by holiness. As God's people, we do things differently. We live by different values. These values will set the Israelites apart from the other nations and people group that will surround them when they enter the Promised Land. And as believers today, these different values should set us apart in the way we live. One of the things I've always been thankful for is that as I was growing up, my parents very early on inculcated in us the understanding that we were walking to the beat of a different drummer. Your friends do this, they believe this, they sing this kind of music, they go to this kind of party, they do these types of things, but we follow different principles. We live by a different code of conduct. We are called to holy, distinct, and separate lives. And yes, as believers, as disciples of Jesus Christ, as followers of God, we stick out like sore thumbs. And what follows is a summary, a short list, a highlight of the snapshots from everyday life where these different values will make a marked difference. It begins with verses 20 to 22 about a situation that might develop with a wealthy landowner who owned some slaves. Verse 20. If a man lies sexually with a woman who's a slave assigned to another man and not yet ransomed or given her freedom, a distinction shall be made. They shall not be put to death because she was not free. But he shall bring his compensation to the Lord to the entrance of the tent of meeting, a ram for a guilt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering before the Lord for his sin that he has committed. And he shall not be forgiven for the sin, and he shall be forgiven for the sin he has committed. Now, every time I read this, there's a little tinge of shock inside of me. In one sense, we would definitely prefer that this text not be there at all. Or we might prefer that this text be an instruction from the Lord to let the slaves go free. You're the people of God, you shouldn't be holding slaves. Now, to be clear, that will eventually come. The people who eventually fought for emancipation and the freeing of slaves did so largely based on the scriptural principles of care and respect for fellow human beings that is at the heart of Leviticus 19. But as a first step, this passage does something remarkable. It shows a remarkable level of care and respect for the slave. At this time, everybody else around them, and still for hundreds and thousands of years after this, would still work under the principle that if you are an owner of a slave, particularly if you're the owner of a female slave, you can do to her as you wish, with no repercussions, with no restrictions. She's your property. You do what you want. You get away with it. There's no repercussions. There's no penalty. There's no crime committed. God says this is not the case. But this is a human being. You're responsible. You're guilty for what you do. If the wealthy Israelite was indeed to live a life of holiness, distinct from the world around him, certainly the first people to notice would have been his employees and his slaves, certainly. Verse 23, looking ahead now when they come into the land that they will inherit. When you come into the land and plant any kind of tree for food, then you shall regard its fruit as forbidden. 3 years it shall be forbidden to you. It must not be eaten. And in the 4th year, all its fruit shall be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. But in the 5th year, you may eat of its fruit to increase its yield for you. I am the Lord your God. So being distinct and separate didn't just mean having respect for your employees, for your staff, for your slaves, if you were still in that system. It also meant having respect for the land and its produce. Now, there's a couple things going on here. Several of the instructions God gave to his people about the land they were entering was based on the principle that the sin of the people, that their sin, their idolatry, their promiscuity, and their uncleanness had spoiled and stained the land, and actually stained the produce of the land they were inheriting. And God says a couple of things. When they arrive here and they plant new seeds, new plants, new trees, new shrubs, new fruits, new veggies, it says for the first 3 years, you're not going to touch it. It's going to be forbidden. Because the land is still working out its impurity. And because the land isn't yours. The land belongs to God. God is lending it to you. God is giving it to you. And so the produce for the first 3 years, you're going to let it spoil. You won't touch the fruit of the trees the first 3 years it produces. You're going to let that rot. You're going to let that drop to the ground to cleanse out the land. And then the 4th year, that crop, that's going to belong to God. You're going to offer it to him. In the 5th year, it's yours. You're going to let the land breathe. When you have a piece of land, when you plant trees, you're not going to be this money-hungering, trying to squeeze every ounce of profit and every penny off this land that you can. Remember the landowner who was reaping in his field. He didn't reap in the corners. He wasn't aggressively trying to squeeze out every penny of profit out of every piece of land that he's got and every acre that you've got. You've got to plant as densely and as thickly as you can right to the corner, and you've got to exact every ounce of profit that you can. And when you plant that vineyard, as soon as there's a grape that comes, by golly, you got to get that grape. You can't leave a grape behind. You got to harvest every single grape that's there and every single blueberry and raspberry and every apple, and you got to get every last ounce of profit out of this piece of land, because you're doing that does 2 things. It would overwork the land. The land wouldn't have a chance to breathe. And you became focused on this profit, on every penny, on every ounce, on everything that could extract from every property that you've got. God says, it's not yours, it's mine. I get first dibs. When the crop is good, I get the first crop. But it wasn't just the people they respected. It wasn't just the product of the land that they respected. Verse 26, you shall not eat any flesh with the blood in it. The blood represented the life of the animal. When I was growing up at home, we were on a little homestead, and every year we raised about 100 chickens and some rabbits, and usually we did a pig every year for food. And in the fall came harvest time, and at harvest that meant that we harvested the blueberries and the corn and the potatoes and the things from the garden. But it was also the moment when we slaughtered the chickens for the winter, and so we would slaughter the chickens and remove the feathers, do all of that, and freeze them, and that way we had meat to eat over the winter. And when we were little, when we were growing up, intentionally, my parents never slaughtered the chickens when we were around. They waited on a day we were in school. And it's not that they didn't want us to understand that there was a price to be paid, that we ate meat, that we were fed, and that there was this process. It's not that we didn't understand that the chicken was killed so that we could eat. That part we understood fairly early on. But that process of taking an animal's life was never done with pleasure, was never done with joy. It was always done heavy-hearted. And I remember when we were old enough that for the first time we helped out with slaughtering the chickens, I was struck that it was not a happy, joyful day. The taking of a life was not something in which my mom and dad took joy and took pleasure. They made sure that as the chickens were slaughtered, that it was done humanely, that it was done carefully, that there was no unnecessary harm or pain inflicted on the animal. And we picked up on this. We picked up on this sense of solemnity in what was happening. And so as the Israelites slaughtered their animals for food or for a sacrifice, it wasn't this fun and this joy and this sport of killing. It was done with respect, with respect for the fact that a life had been taken. And as they drained that blood from the animal, not to eat the blood, there was a symbol there and the value of a life. Now, the next step is peculiar. He next talks about interpreting omens and telling fortunes. We think the reason the two are together is that typically they were done when an animal was slaughtered. You would slaughter an animal and you would look at its gizzards and you would look at its kidneys and you would look at what was its stomach, and that would give you indications about the future. There was a part of interpreting omens and telling fortunes that was related to the slaughtering of animals. So don't do this. Don't interpret omens. Don't tell fortunes. There's a link with verse 31. He says in verse 31, do not turn to mediums or to necromancers. Do not seek them out and so make yourselves unclean by them. I'm the Lord your God. The word necromancers is an interesting word. It's got the word for speaking and the word for dead in it. It's the Hebrew word for a ventriloquist, because you throw your voice into an inanimate object. You make believe that the puppet is talking. You make believe that the animal is talking. Necromancers were shysters. They were deceivers. They were throwing their voice. They were making you believe that the dead person was talking. They were giving a voice to an inanimate, dead animal or dead person. It's a cheat. And verse 31 suggests that to go to them would be making yourself unclean, not just because those practices themselves dabbled in the occult and the demonic, but also because wrapped up with this was this whole world of immorality and impurity. There was idolatry involved. There were all kinds of things they did to their bodies. It was related with sexual impurity in prostitution. And so in verse 27, he continues with the kinds of things that these demonic worshipers and these necromancers and these fortune tellers did. Verse 27, you shall not round off the hair on your temples or mar the edges of your beard. You shall not make cuts on your body for the dead or tattoo yourselves. I am the Lord. Do not profane your daughter by making her a prostitute, lest the land fall into prostitution, the land become full of depravity. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. This is the worship that they were going into. As they were going into the land of Egypt, and Psalm 106 alluded to some of this before, as they were going into the land of Egypt, there was this corrupt worship. It's not just that they had to avoid watching their television stations. It's not just that they had to avoid going to the local brothels in the big city. That wasn't the problem. The problem were the centers of worship. The most corrupt thing was their idolatry and their temples. It involved all kinds of things. When Elijah's facing off against the prophets of Baal, you remember as they're crying out to God, they're gashing themselves and cutting themselves as they're praying and pleading with their God. They were all about tattoos and weird haircuts and doing things to their body and body piercings, and all of this was involved in this demonic worship that was there to the point of child and adolescent prostitution. And so as you can feel the intensity building up, these people, they're trying to talk to the dead. They're trying to tell the fortune by gutting animals open. They're doing this with yelling and incantations and spiritism and talking to the dead and cutting their bodies and drawing on themselves and piercing their bodies and profanity and sexual immorality and prostitution and all this depravity. And in verse 30, God finally says, stop. You just keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. It's meant to give you whiplash. You're meant to think about all of this terrible, awfully ungodly stuff happening in these temples, in this idolatry, in this awful worship, with all of that stuff that happened there. And in contrast, God says, stop. When you come to worship me, you come on the Sabbath in calm reverence and holiness. None of this fooling around. None of this stupidity. None of this immorality. None of this. When you worship me, you come on the Sabbath with calm and quiet and still hearts, in purity and in holiness and in sanctity and in righteousness before me, with reverence for the Sabbath and for my sanctuary. Why? Because I am the Lord. because I am the Lord. The outcome of that kind of immoral and violent worship, says God, would work itself out in the stuff of everyday life. Because ultimately, God knew this. Ultimately, you become what you worship. Whether it's the movie stars that you spend hours watching and Googling over on TV, you become what you worship. When the Canaanites worshipped gods like Moloch, he was a giant head without a body. He was almost cartoonish if it hadn't been so scary. It was a giant head without a body, but it had a massive open mouth with teeth bared. And there was a fire that was constantly blazing night and day, so hot that you could barely approach. And if you were a follower of Moloch, when you had your firstborn child in the first days of its life, you were to bring it and throw it alive into the fire. How could you do this and not have that impact your values, your principles, and the way you lead your life? How could you get to the point of being so stone cold as to sacrifice your newborn child to the flames and not have that impact the kind of person that you are the rest of the week? When the God you worship required the wanton, brutal killing of animals without empathy or care, drinking and eating its blood, causing it pain as you slaughtered it, how could you not eventually reach the point of thinking that a life, any life, human or otherwise, was just a thing that you could trivialize and play with at the drop of a hat? When the idol you worship required you to prostitute your teenage daughters to ritual prostitution at the temple, how could you go home and have any hope of raising the rest of your children in purity with any kind of moral standard? God's point is clear. There's always a link between who we worship and how we worship them and how we live. The real worship of the pure and holy God always works itself out in a life that is ordered, that is marked by purity, by charity, by chastity, and by integrity, and by care and respect for life. And the text provides just 3 closing examples. If we are this kind of people who worship God in this way, who come into His temple on the Sabbath with reverence and with awe, our respect for the authority of God will work itself out in our respect for the authority figures in our lives, including our parents, our grandparents, and our seniors. Remember how chapter started in verses 2 and 3, chapter 19. We started out and he said, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Every one of you shall revere his parents." We go back to the same theme. It returns full circle now in verse 32. "You shall stand before the gray head and honor the face of an old man, and you shall fear your God. I am the Lord." What does this mean? It means that when you're sitting down in a room and an older person walks in, you stand up out of reverence. It's not that you're giving them your seat. It's that when you're seated in a room and you're chatting with your friends, watching TV, whatever you're doing, and a senior and an older person comes in, out of respect, you stand and you give it a little bow of deference. I am appalled on the bus and the metro how hard it is for a senior, someone with a cane, in a walker, to get a seat. And he's not even talking about that here. They just walk in the room. And out of respect, you stand quietly. I think God would have something to say with what we've done in our CHSLDs, in the way our seniors, unfortunately, our institution have paid much of the price for COVID, in the way we've mismanaged that. You shall stand up before the gray head and honor the face of an old man, and you shall fear your God. Not only will our respect and reverence for God translate into respect for the elderly and those in authority of us, and for our mums and dads and our grandparents that we love and that we know well, it goes beyond that. Our understanding that we serve a just and a gracious and a merciful God who looked upon us with kindness and love when we were the outcast, the foreigner, and the stranger, understanding that that is what God has been for us, will deeply alter the way we treat the stranger who lives among us. So we treat the gray hair and the older man with respect in verse 33. When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you. You shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And maybe it's because many of the sojourners and strangers who are among them would be doing trade and selling and buying merchandise that God makes the next step very practical. Verse 35. You shall do no wrong in judgment in measures of length or weight or quantity. And you go, pardon me? Hear this out. You shall have just balances, just weights, a just ephah, and a just hin. I understand what he's talking about. When you go to the market today, everything is pre-weighed for you. So you buy a kilogram of ground beef, and you buy a pound of butter, and whatever you buy, it's there, and it's pre-marked. But when you went to the market, there was just these big bins of grain and these big bushels of raisins and apples, whatever you wanted to buy. And when you wanted to buy an ephah or a hin, one is a measurement of size. It's like a gallon, and the other one's a measurement of weight. And so what they would do is that if you came and you wanted to buy a bushel of apples, well, there was a basket, and this basket, it's a bushel. It's a full bushel. And so you take this bushel of apples, you fill it with apples right to the edge. There you go. You now have a bushel of apples. It's, this much. Here you pay your money, and you get a bushel of apples. Well, the guy in the market, he could kind of cheat you a little. Because behind the counter, he's got 2 bushels, right? Because when he's buying apples from his supplier, he wants to buy a big bushel. He wants to buy a bushel that has an extra, 10% to it, But then when he's selling you a bushel of apples, you come and you buy a bushel of apples from him. Well, the basket's a little smaller. It's, maybe 90% of a bushel. And then the hin, the measurement of weight, you come and you want to buy half a pound of butter. So he's got a little scale, and on one side he's got a little metal piece that weighs a pound, and he scoops butter on the other side until the scale balances out, and then you've got a pound of butter. But again, they would have 2 different sets of weights and measurements. God says you don't do that. How strange is this, isn't it? You shall have just balances, just weights, a just ephah, and a just hin. Why? Because it's better for business. No. Because I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and you shall observe all my statutes and all my rules, and do them. I am the Lord. I remember getting into a heated discussion with a lady who was a good friend many years ago in another congregation. She was a fine, upstanding lady and good Christian all her life, and did a lot of work for the community and respected her a great deal. And we had to take the bus together at one point to get to a meeting. And as we were going for the bus, and it worked a little differently back then, there was a bus pass, and the bus pass for students and for seniors was discounted. Now, it'll show you how long ago this was. The discounted bus pass for students and for seniors was $19. That's how long ago the story was. So it's nobody you know. And that bus pass was non-transferable. So you had a little plastic flip thing, and in the top you had your picture, and in the bottom you had your monthly bus pass. And your bus pass was associated to you. So I had a bus pass, Debbie had a bus pass. We couldn't share a bus pass. That's not the way the system worked. And as we ran to the bus together, I realized she was shuffling her bus pass. Her son was a student. He studied during the day, and she usually went out for meetings at night, so they shared a bus pass together, which they weren't supposed to do. That's not the way it works. And I was a little taken aback, and I said, as respectfully as I could to a senior, I expressed some concern that this was not, and I'll never forget, she looked at me and said, it's just $19. It doesn't matter. It's a small thing. It's $19. She says, you're looking at me like if I'd stolen $1 million. And I have to tell you, there's moments I wish I had the ability to bite my tongue and keep my mouth shut. This wasn't one of them. And I said, I would prefer that you'd have stolen the $1 million. And she said, what? And I said, because then it would tell me that the price of your conscience, the price of your integrity is $1 million. But I've just learned that the price of your integrity before God is $19. And it's funny, isn't it? We think of it as the reverse. We think of the small stuff, and it's small stuff. What is it to, take an extra dollar out of a vending machine, we cut on our taxes, and we cut $3 here. It's $3. What's $3? It's not like I'm, hiding $100,000 in income somewhere. It's $3. But that $3 says that the price of your conscience is $3. That's how much it takes to bribe you to forget the principles of holiness and sanctity that you're called to live. And so it kind of puts life in the reverse. And so this God who calls us to be holy and sacred and separate to Him, He cares a great deal even about the detail stuff. The way we stand when a senior walks into a room out of respect. The way we look at somebody of a different language, of a different color, or different ethnicity, who's a refugee, who's an immigrant, who doesn't quite know the way we do things, we look askance at them because they're somehow worth a little less, or the way we cut corners with our pennies and our dimes and our toonies and noonies. The holiness of God that we are called to live out is to be lived out in every detail of life. From the handful of change in my pocket to the way I raise my children. From the things I do at church on Sunday morning to the way I buy my groceries on Thursday night. In every aspect of life, we're called to be separate, distinct, living out the holiness of God. Father, we are called to be holy because you are holy. How tempting it is to cut corners, to assume that there's little things and little details where it doesn't matter. Father, give us the wisdom to let you into all of our lives, into the decisions we make, the small and the large. For Father, in each one of these areas, we want to reflect your love, your grace, your respect for the sanctity of life, your integrity, your values, your holiness. May we live these things out. We ask in Christ's name. Amen.